What if the trauma you're struggling with today actually belongs, to your grandparents?
I know, it sounds almost like science fiction, right? But it's biology.
It really is. In 2015, researchers were looking at the DNA of Holocaust survivors, and they discovered something that biological science considered basically impossible for a long time.
Yeah, a massive paradigm shift.
Right. They found that the extreme starvation-level stress and just the profound terror experienced in the camps didn't just cause psychological damage, it actually left these chemical tags on their DNA.
Physical, measurable markers.
Exactly. And when those survivors had children who grew up in totally safe environments, who obviously never experienced the Holocaust themselves, those kids carried the exact same chemical tags on their stress response genes.
It bypassed conscious memory entirely. It literally wrote itself directly into their biological code.
Which is just mind-blowing. And it brings us to our mission today. Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Glad to be here.
We are taking on this massive, incredibly detailed, heavily cited Wikipedia article that compiles all the medical, historical, and anthropological data on post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD.
And there is a lot to unpack.
So much to unpack. And if you are listening to this right now, whether you are a clinician or someone trying to support a partner, or you're just, deeply curious about the extreme edges of human biology, this deep dive is going to completely reframe how you view memory, survival, and resilience.
We're going to look right under the hood at the neurobiology.
Yes, we'll explore why two people can endure the exact same car crash, but only one develops a chronic disorder. And we'll look at some really severe controversies in modern pharmacology, too.
But I think we have to start by recognizing that this is not a modern phenomenon at all.
Right. It's not just a product of modern warfare or modern society.
Not even close.
Yeah.
The human nervous system has been reacting to extreme threat for as long as we've walked the earth. The source material points to clinical descriptions of trauma long before psychiatry even existed.
Yeah, I saw that. We have records from Assyrian soldiers dating back to, 1300 BCE?
Exactly, 1300 BCE.
I was reading through those Assyrian accounts, and the logistical nightmare those soldiers faced is just, it's terrifying. They were doing 3-year continuous combat rotations.
3 years of hand-to-hand, visceral survival. No modern buffers.
None. And the texts describe these men coming back to their quiet agricultural societies and being completely unable to reconcile that hyperviolence with civilian life.
They documented being haunted, right?
Yeah, they said the ghosts of the men they killed were haunting them in their sleep.
Which is, it's just this beautiful, tragic, ancient metaphor for what we now clinically call intrusive re-experiencing.
Wow. Yeah, you're right. It's the exact same symptom.
And you see this echoed everywhere in history. Look at the Great Fire of London in 1666. Samuel Pepys, the English diarist, he didn't just write about the fire.
He wrote about his own psychological fallout, didn't he?
Yes, with clinical precision. For months afterward, he wrote about not being able to sleep without waking up terrified, dreaming of falling buildings in flames.
And then there's Shakespeare. The source highlights psychiatrist Jonathan Shea's analysis of Henry IV, Part 1.
Written way back around 1597.
You're right. And Lady Percy delivers this soliloquy where she's essentially diagnosing her husband. She doesn't just say, oh, he's sad.
She lists the physical symptoms.
Exactly. Disrupted sleep, sudden violent outbursts, sweating, hyperarousal. It mirrors the modern diagnostic manual centuries before anyone thought to medicalize it.
But, and this is the big but, the way society chose to name these symptoms over the centuries reveals a lot about our discomfort with psychological injury.
Oh, the George Carlin critique.
Yes. The comedian George Carlin delivered this famous critique on the euphemism treadmill, which our sources cite directly. It tracks this historical desperation to sort of sanitize the horror of war.
The evolution of the vocabulary is chilling when you line it up. So, in World War I, soldiers in the trenches facing continuous artillery bombardment. The condition was called shell shock.
2 syllables.
2 syllables. Guttural, violent, and it perfectly describes the mechanical, concussive reality of what was happening to them. But by World War II, they softened it.
They changed it to battle fatigue.
Right. Because fatigue implies you just need a nap and a warm meal.
It frames a severe neurological injury as a temporary lack of stamina. It served the military's logistical need to get men back to the front lines.
And then in Korea, it shifted to operational exhaustion.
Which sounds like a machine breaking down, not a human being.
And finally, after Vietnam, we get post-traumatic stress disorder. Carlin's argument was that by adding the hyphen and burying it in medical jargon, we successfully sanitized the pain right out of existence.
Because the language we use really dictates the empathy we extend.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because you see this reflected in the very first Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM-I from 1952. PTSD wasn't in there.
No, they had something called gross stress reaction.
Which is such an artifact of its time.
It really is. In 1952, they defined it as a normal personality, using established reactions to deal with overwhelming fear. They viewed it as totally temporary.
So if the symptoms lasted long term, what did they think it was?
The clinicians back then just assumed the patient must have had a pre-existing neurosis. They literally couldn't fathom that a healthy brain could be permanently changed by a single event.
It's like treating a flashing check engine light on your dashboard by just putting a piece of black tape over it. We kept changing the name of the light without ever looking under the hood at the engine.
And the moment they were finally forced to open the hood was the 1970s. The scale of the crisis after Vietnam made denial mathematically impossible.
Over 830,000 U.S. veterans came back exhibiting severe trauma.
You had hundreds of thousands of young men experiencing profound distress, substance abuse, alienation. It was a public health emergency. The old vocabulary just failed.
But the paradigm shift didn't just happen because of the military, right? The sources point to a massive breakthrough in the civilian sector in 1975.
Yes, Ann Wilbert Burgess and Linda Little Holmstrom published their research defining rape trauma syndrome.
A watershed moment.
Absolutely. They mapped out the psychological aftermath in civilian women who survived sexual assault. And what they proved, irrefutably, was that the symptom clusters were identical.
The nightmares, the hypervigilance, the emotional numbing.
Functionally identical to combat veterans surviving firefights.
So it proved that this response isn't a military condition. It's a deeply conserved, biological human response to overwhelming threat, completely regardless of the context.
Exactly. By marrying the military data with the civilian data, psychiatry finally had the empirical weight to demand a new classification. And that pushed PTSD into the DSM-3 in 1980.
And defining it was the only way to actually study it scientifically.
Right. And if we look at the criteria today, we see how far it's come. The current manual, the DSM-5 from 2013, has incredibly rigorous standards.
For a diagnosis today, symptoms have to persist for more than a month, and they have to significantly impair daily functioning.
And they are broken down into 4 distinct clusters.
Let's walk through those clusters, because I think it pulls the condition out of the abstract for anyone listening. The first cluster is re-experiencing, and this isn't just remembering a bad day, right?
Far from it. Remembering is a conscious choice to retrieve information. Re-experiencing in PTSD is involuntary and intrusive.
Like flashbacks.
Yes, dissociative flashbacks, where the brain literally loses its tether to present reality. Subjectively, the person experiences the trauma as if it's unfolding right now.
And nightmares, too.
Severe, repetitive nightmares. The data shows they affect roughly 50 to 70% of individuals with PTSD. The physical terror continues long after the danger is gone.
Which naturally leads to the second cluster, avoidance. I mean, if your brain is ambushing you with the worst moment of your life, you'll do anything to stop it.
Avoidance is highly complex because it's both external and internal.
External meaning altering your life, like refusing to drive after a car accident.
Exactly. Or avoiding crowded places, cutting off relationships. Internally, it's an intense effort to suppress memories or feelings. In severe cases, it leads to dissociative amnesia, where the mind walls off the memory entirely to protect the conscious self.
Wow. The third cluster is negative alterations in cognition and mood. This is where it seems like the trauma poisons a person's entire worldview.
Pervasive negative beliefs. The idea that the world is entirely dangerous or that they are completely broken, it brings a distorted sense of blame.
But the most insidious part of this cluster, from reading the sources, is anhedonia.
Anhedonia is the profound inability to experience positive emotions. It's a flattening of the human experience.
People report feeling entirely detached from the people they love.
Yes, they lose interest in everything that used to bring joy. It's not just sadness, it's a neurological numbness.
And finally, the fourth cluster is alterations in arousal and reactivity, the hyperarousal state.
The nervous system is just stuck on high alert.
So hair trigger startle response, chronic insomnia.
Intense irritability, aggressive outbursts. The brain is constantly scanning for threats that don't exist, which burns an immense amount of metabolic energy.
And that leads to self-destructive behavior sometimes.
Often, yes. Seeding high-stimulation environments to match the internal chaos. or turning to substances to artificially dampen the alarm.
What I found fascinating about the DSM-5 update is that they removed PTSD from the anxiety disorders category entirely.
It used to sit right next to generalized anxiety.
Right, but now it has its own category, trauma and stressor-related disorders. It's a massive acknowledgement that it's an acquired injury from an external event, not just a general chemical imbalance.
And that aligns globally too. The World Health Organization uses the ICD-11, which takes a slightly more streamlined approach. It focuses strictly on 3 core elements: re-experiencing in the present, avoidance, and a heightened sense of current threat.
So they dropped the non-specific thoughts. But the vital thing in the ICD-11 is the introduction of a totally new category: complex PTSD.
CPTSD. This addresses a massive gap. Standard PTSD is modeled around a single finite event, a car crash, an assault. The threat happens, it ends, and the aftermath begins.
But complex PTSD is different.
It captures the injury that occurs during prolonged, repeated traumatization where the victim has no viable means of escape.
We're talking about survivors of chronic childhood abuse, long-term domestic violence, human trafficking.
Or prisoners of war. When a nervous system is subjected to sustained terror over years, the injury goes far deeper. It encompasses standard PTSD, but adds severe disruptions to the individual's core identity.
Profound difficulties in emotional regulation, the belief of being permanently damaged.
Yes, the prolonged captivity fundamentally alters the architecture of the personality.
So having defined all these criteria, we have to look at the demographics. Who actually fits into these boxes? Because if you ask a random person to picture someone with PTSD, they'll almost always picture a military veteran in combat gear.
But the statistical reality completely shatters that stereotype. Military personnel are at high risk, obviously, but they're only a fraction of the overall population suffering from this.
Right. To understand the demographics, you have to realize how common trauma actually is. The sources say over 60% of men and women will experience at least one qualifying traumatic event in their lifetimes.
60%. But, crucially, the vast majority of those people do not develop PTSD.
In the U.S., about 3.5% of adults have PTSD in any given year, with a lifetime risk around 9%. Globally, it's about 0.5 to 1% annually.
Though that spikes in conflict zones, of course.
Of course. But if 60% experience trauma and less than 10% develop the disorder, what is the determining factor?
It is heavily weighted on the type of trauma. Not all life-threatening events impact the brain equally.
The highest recorded risk is torture, right?
Yes, exposure to torture carries an estimated 40% risk of developing the disorder. But right behind that is interpersonal violence. Sexual violence carries an 11.4% risk, and rape specifically carries a 19% risk.
Nearly 1 in 5 rape victims will develop full-blown PTSD. And if you contrast that with a car crash, surviving a non-life-threatening crash is about a 2.6% risk, and even a life-threatening one is only 4.6%.
Because of the underlying psychological mechanism. Yeah. The violation of trust.
Right, a car crash is impersonal. It's just the chaos of the universe.
But interpersonal trauma rape, torture, is an intentional infliction of harm by another human being. It shatters the social contract, it destroys bodily autonomy, and the baseline assumption that other humans are safe. That betrayal makes the psychological injury far more virulent.
Which brings us to a really unsettling statistical reality about gender. Men actually experience a higher total number of traumatic events in their lifetimes: assaults, accidents, combat. Yet women are more than twice as likely to develop lifetime PTSD.
Because of the nature of the traumas, women face a vastly disproportionate amount of high-impact interpersonal traumas, specifically sexual assault and intimate partner violence.
That's horrifying. But the threat matrix isn't just violence. The sources dive into everyday civilian traumas. I was stunned that the most common traumatic event reported globally is the unexpected death of a loved one.
The most ubiquitous form of severe trauma. And while the conversion rate to PTSD is low, roughly 5.2%, the sheer volume of people who experience sudden grief is astronomical.
So because of that massive denominator, sudden loss accounts for roughly 20% of all PTSD cases worldwide, 1/5 of the global burden.
It's staggering.
And then there's medical trauma. We view hospitals as places of healing, but for the nervous system, they can be terrifying. 22% of cancer survivors present with lifetime cancer-related PTSD.
It's a massive blind spot in modern medicine. Oncology focuses on eradicating the tumor. We subject the body to toxic chemo, aggressive radiation, invasive surgeries.
We put them in ICUs with constant alarms where sleep is impossible.
The physical body survives, but the brain registers the medical intervention as a severe, inescapable threat. We see the same fallout in heart attack survivors or patients on ventilators.
And maternal health, too. Women who experience miscarriages or childbirth complications like severe hemorrhage or an emergency C-section face highly elevated risks.
We really have to widen our lens of what constitutes trauma, and that includes occupational hazards beyond the military.
First responders, naturally. Paramedics, firefighters.
But also ER nurses, journalists in disaster zones, and civilian workers like bank tellers who face armed robbery. Trauma is woven into everyday society.
But this brings us to a central pushback, the real mystery here. Let's go back to the car crash. Two people, same age, same car, T-boned at an intersection. Physical threat is identical. They both walk away with scrapes.
The classic hypothetical.
Right. Why does person A feel shaken for a week and then go back to normal, but person B develops chronic, debilitating PTSD? If the trauma is identical, what dictates the vulnerability?
That question drives billions of dollars in neurobiological research. The consensus is that the trauma is strictly the trigger, but vulnerability is highly individualized, and a lot of it is inherited in our DNA.
The sources estimate genetics account for roughly 30% of the variance, and they prove this through twin studies.
Yes. If an identical twin who shares 100% of their DNA develops PTSD after combat, their twin is at a significantly higher risk if they also experience trauma, compared to fraternal twins who only share 50%.
But it's not just the DNA sequence you were born with, which loops us back to Dr. Rachel Yehuda's work on epigenetics. How does that explain vulnerability?
Epigenetics is how environmental factors influence gene expression, how experiences turn genetic markers on or off without changing the sequence itself. Dr. Yehuda looked at the FKBP5 gene,
which regulates the stress hormone response.
Exactly. In Holocaust survivors, she found the extreme trauma had altered the methylation of this gene.
Let's break down methylation for the listener. If your DNA is an instruction manual, methylation is like someone coming along and highlighting paragraphs or gluing pages together so they can't be read. It amplifies or silences the gene.
That's an excellent analogy. The starvation and terror chemically glued the pages of the FKBP5 gene, altering how those bodies handled stress forever. But the paradigm-shattering part was that their adult children had the exact same altered methylation patterns.
The parents' biological adaptation to horror was packaged and passed down. So your vulnerability to a car crash today might be heavily influenced by what your grandparents survived decades ago.
Precisely. Which leads us into the evolutionary psychology perspective. They argue we shouldn't view PTSD purely as a broken brain.
The smoke detector principle.
Yes. They view hypervigilance not as a malfunction, but as a highly evolved survival mechanism stuck in the on position.
I found this framework so helpful. Explain the math behind the smoke detector.
Think about the smoke detector in your hallway. You want it to be hypersensitive. You absolutely want it to trigger a loud alarm when you burn toast.
Because the cost of a false alarm is just annoyance.
But the cost of a failed alarm, if the house is actually on fire and it stays silent, is lethal.
Better safe than dead.
Exactly. In our ancestral environment, if an early human barely survived a predator attack by a river, it was a massive evolutionary advantage to develop an exaggerated startle response to any movement in the brush.
It was advantageous to recall the exact location of the attack so they never went near that riverbed again.
The symptoms of PTSD are essentially just dysregulated extreme manifestations of those ancient defensive algorithms. The smoke detector is blaring to keep the organism alive, but the brain has lost the ability to realize the fire is out.
Which is the perfect transition. If it's an ancient survival mechanism stuck in overdrive, we have to look under the hood. What is physically happening in a traumatized brain? Let's start with the HPA axis.
The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. It's the complex neuroendocrine network that governs how you react to stress.
So say a car swerves into your lane, the amygdala detects danger and signals the hypothalamus.
The command center. It releases a hormone to the pituitary gland, which signals the adrenal glands on your kidneys. Within milliseconds, your adrenals flood your blood with catecholamines, primarily adrenaline and norepinephrine.
The fight-or-flight juice. Heart rate spikes, pupils dilate, you swerve and survive. What happens next in a healthy system?
Once the threat is neutralized, the adrenal glands release cortisol. Cortisol's job is to apply the brakes. It tells the hypothalamus to stop the alarm and returns the body to homeostasis.
And this is where the neurobiology of PTSD gets wildly counterintuitive. You'd assume someone constantly hypervigilant, constantly having nightmares, would be drowning in cortisol.
But the data shows the exact opposite. The defining paradox of the disorder is that many PTSD patients exhibit significantly low baseline levels of cortisol paired with chronically high levels of norepinephrine.
So what does that specific imbalance actually mean for the patient?
It means their physiological fire alarm is ringing continuously. High norepinephrine keeps them aroused, heart racing, hypervigilant. But lacking cortisol means they don't have the brakes.
The fire is burning out of control and there's no water to put it out.
Exactly, leading to prolonged, distressing panic.
And the sources reference a study showing this low cortisol state might actually predate the trauma. They studied Swedish soldiers before a peacekeeping mission in Bosnia. The ones with naturally lower cortisol before deployment were at a much higher risk of developing PTSD after combat.
It suggests a biologically weaker braking system makes you incredibly vulnerable when the stress cascade hits, and living with that imbalance structurally alters the brain over time, particularly the amygdala and the hippocampus.
Let's start with the amygdala, the fear center. What goes wrong there?
The basolateral nucleus, the BLA, pairs sensory stimuli with fear. It learns that a helicopter sound equals danger. Then it activates the central nucleus, the CEA, which triggers the physical fear response.
Sweating, startle. So in a traumatized brain, this system is hyperactive.
It is, but it's compounded by a failure in the regulatory system. In a healthy brain, the amygdala is supervised by the medial prefrontal cortex, the logical center.
So if I hear a massive bang, my amygdala spikes in fear. But a second later, my prefrontal cortex realizes it was just a truck backfiring and shuts the fear off.
Extinction learning. But in someone with PTSD, functional MRI scans show hypoactivity in the medial prefrontal cortex.
The inhibitory signals are too weak.
Yes, the logical brain fails to exert top-down control. The fear response to the backfiring truck cannot be extinguished. The panic runs unchecked.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because while the amygdala runs unchecked, the hippocampus is actually physically degrading. A 2007 MRI study of Vietnam vets with severe PTSD showed up to a 20% reduction in the volume of their hippocampus. A fifth of it had atrophied. Why is that so devastating?
Because the hippocampus is the master architect of memory. It takes sensory info, encodes it, and gives it spatial and temporal context. It stamps an event with a time and place, categorizing it as the past.
I always think of it like a meticulous librarian. In a healthy brain, a terrifying thing happens, and the librarian gathers the sights and sounds, binds them into a book, stamps it with the date, and files it away on the past shelf.
So years later, you feel sad, but you know it already happened.
Right, the danger is over. But during extreme trauma, the flood of stress hormones, the glucocorticoids, is highly neurotoxic to the hippocampus.
It effectively suppresses the librarian.
The filing system collapses. The memory doesn't get a date stamp. The librarian just drops this raw, terrifying sensory data right in the middle of the reading room floor. And the brain keeps tripping over it, convinced the trauma is happening right now.
That is the precise mechanism of a flashback. A trigger hits, a smell, a tone of voice, and the raw memory is retrieved without any context. The amygdala processes it as a present tense threat.
And the physical toll of this constant panic is immense. It extends into neuroimmunology. Patients show chronically elevated inflammatory cytokines and reduced activation of microglia in the brain.
Microglia manage the inflammatory response in the central nervous system. The research shows a distinct neuroimmune suppression in chronic PTSD.
And that suppression correlates strongly with the severity of anhedonia.
Yes. It provides biological proof that the profound emotional numbness isn't just a psychological defense. It's rooted in physical immunological dysfunction. The hardware is altered.
Which brings us to the most urgent question. If the alarm system is imbalanced, the prefrontal cortex can't hit the brakes, the hippocampus shrinks, and the immune system is misfiring. How do we fix it? How do we rewire a traumatized brain?
It's arduous, but neuroplasticity dictates that it is possible, and the consensus across clinical guidelines is that the first line of defense is not medication, it's psychotherapy.
Trauma-focused counseling is vastly superior to medication.
Yes, medication manages symptoms, but therapy targets the neurobiological dysfunction. The two most robust approaches are cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and prolonged exposure therapy.
CBT targets those negative cognitive alterations, challenging the distorted beliefs like overwhelming guilt and replacing them.
But prolonged exposure therapy is where the heavy lifting happens.
Which sounds terrifying for a patient. You're asking someone whose brain is doing everything to avoid a memory to intentionally step back into it.
It is intensely difficult, which is why it must be done in a highly controlled, safe environment. It's based on habituation. The therapist guides the survivor to confront memories and triggers, both imaginally recounting the story in present tense detail and in vivo.
So for a car crash survivor, in vivo might mean sitting in the driver's seat of a parked car for 10 minutes, tolerating the rising panic until the brain realizes it isn't going to die.
Precisely. Exposure therapy is essentially physical therapy for the medial prefrontal cortex. By repeatedly triggering the fear memory in a safe environment, the prefrontal cortex practices sending inhibitory signals to the amygdala.
It physically strengthens that neural pathway and achieves extinction learning.
Exactly. And alongside that, guidelines heavily endorse EMDR eye movement desensitization and reprocessing.
Developed by Francine Shapiro in the late 80s. The story goes she was walking in a park, thinking about distressing memories, noticed her eyes darting back and forth, and realized her distress was decreasing.
And she built a highly structured clinical therapy around it. The patient holds the traumatic memory in mind while tracking the therapist's finger moving side to side.
I have to admit, looking at the mechanics of EMDR, it sounds a bit like neurological voodoo. I saw a different theory that made more sense to me. The working memory tax. Is it basically a biological distraction technique?
The working memory hypothesis is very compelling.
Like rubbing your belly and patting your head while thinking of trauma to overload the brain's RAM. If the brain's working memory has 8 gigabytes of RAM, the trauma memory tries to consume all 8, crashing the system into a panic attack.
But tracking a moving finger requires immense computational power. It eats up 3 gigabytes.
So the trauma memory simply doesn't have enough processing power available to induce full panic. The system stays calm, allowing the prefrontal cortex to realize the memory is safe.
That RAM analogy perfectly captures it. And meta-reviews show EMDR and standard TBT are practically indistinguishable in long-term effectiveness. The therapy undeniably works. The controversy is just over the why. Many argue the eye movement is a highly effective form of exposure therapy wrapped in a ritual that taxes working memory enough to prevent dissociation.
That makes perfect sense. Let's look at medication, because millions are prescribed drugs, but the efficacy data seems really modest.
Modest is the exact term in the literature. There are 4 specific antidepressants that show small to modest benefit over a placebo: sertraline, fluoxetine, paroxetine, and venlafaxine, SSRIs and SNRIs.
But they don't fix the underlying structural damage. They don't regrow the hippocampus.
They do not. They blunt the jagged edges of the symptoms. By regulating serotonin, they reduce severe negative moods and baseline anxiety, giving the patient an alpha-1 adrenergic antagonist. Clinicians realized it suppresses the sympathetic nervous system just enough to inhibit the massive adrenaline spikes that cause trauma nightmares.
It lowers the volume on the nighttime alarm. The FDA also approved a digital therapeutic for this, an Apple Watch app called Nightwear. It monitors heart rate and movement and gently vibrates to interrupt a nightmare without fully waking the patient.
Excellent examples of targeted symptom relief. But this raises an important question, and perhaps the most severe clinical warning in the literature: benzodiazepines.
Drugs like Xanax, Valium, Klonopin, powerful anti-anxiety meds prescribed globally for panic. Why are they so controversial for PTSD?
Because the clinical evidence strongly indicates they are actively harmful for trauma patients. Guidelines explicitly state they are contraindicated.
Which is confusing. If someone is having a massive panic attack from a flashback, wouldn't a rapid-acting anti-anxiety drug be exactly what they need?
In the immediate 10 minutes, yes, it sedates the acute panic. But the danger is the mechanism of that sedation. Benzos induce emotional blunting and dissociation.
And exposure therapy requires you to be emotionally present.
Exactly. To achieve extinction learning, the patient must feel the fear memory and allow the prefrontal cortex to realize it's safe. If the brain is chemically sedated by a benzodiazepine, that learning pathway is blocked. You cannot rewire a brain that is chemically turned off.
You're artificially enforcing the avoidance cluster, helping the brain hide.
Precisely. The data shows benzo use worsen psychotherapy outcomes, and if given right after a trauma, they can actually increase the risk of developing PTSD by 2 to 5 times. They mask immediate symptoms while letting the disorder metastasize.
Wow. Which brings us to frontier treatments. The most debated right now is MDMA-assisted psychotherapy.
Yes, pairing clinical doses of MDMA with intensive psychotherapy sessions.
The biological theory is fascinating. MDMA triggers massive serotonin and oxytocin release, dampens the amygdala, and increases trust. It creates a neurochemical safety window, allowing the patient to confront horrific memories without the overwhelming terror that usually causes them to quit therapy.
Phase 3 trials showed remarkable efficacy. A large percentage no longer met PTSD criteria. However, in 2024, the U.S. FDA officially rejected the new drug application.
That sends shockwaves. What was their rationale?
The FDA raised severe concerns about the trial design, specifically expectancy bias and functional unblinding. The psychoactive effects of MGMA are so obvious that nearly every patient knew if they got the drug or the placebo.
And that unblinding plus the enthusiasm created a massive bias.
They argued to compromise the efficacy data. They also cited cardiovascular safety concerns and potential for therapist misconduct during vulnerable dosing sessions.
A massive setback in the US, but Australia authorized it under strict frameworks, and Canada opened pathways too.
The global community is also wrestling with medical cannabinoids. Veterans heavily use cannabis to self-medicate, but the scientific consensus remains highly cautioned. While it provides acute relief for insomnia, there's no robust clinical data proving it treats the underlying neurobiology, and it may exacerbate long-term avoidance.
As we survey all these interventions, it becomes apparent they are deeply embedded in a highly specific Western medical paradigm. The goal is to isolate a dysfunction in the brain and repair it.
Which is great for a broken bone, but cultural and medical anthropologists raise massive questions about trauma. Does the DSM-5 model actually translate globally?
The anthropological critique is fascinating. They argue that while the physiological experience of threat is universal, how trauma is expressed and integrated depends entirely on language and societal norms. You can't just translate the DSM-5 checklist.
Applying an American framework everywhere is considered a category fallacy. It ignores local idioms of distress. The ethnopsychology studies in Nepal demonstrate this perfectly.
In Nepal, the cultural concept aligning with trauma is pida, but an individual suffering from severe pida is often stigmatized as pathgal, meaning mad or insane. It carries severe social ostracization.
It doesn't map onto the Western concept of an honorable war injury. If a Western clinician treats pida with a standard PTSD workbook, ignoring the local social stigma, the intervention will likely fail or inflict more social harm.
And many non-Western cultures are collectivist, not individualist. They view the individual as linked to their community and ancestors. The sources mention refugees in Burundi and Sudan. Western teams found high distress, but not the neat four-cluster symptomology of the DSM-5.
Because their distress was fundamentally oriented differently. The Sudanese refugees emphasized the loss of their land, the severing of community ties. Their suffering was social and structural, not an internal psychological pathology to be fixed with individual therapy.
Trauma there isn't an amygdala disorder. It's soul loss or a weak heart, an affliction of the spirit. The healing process has to be communal, with religious rituals and familial restoration, a spirit-body approach.
Anthropologists suggest applying the PTSD label places the burden of illness on the individual's brain. Terms like social suffering or cultural bereavement appropriately focus on the societal destruction.
So, what does this all mean? If we connect this back to George Carlin's euphemism, treadmill, shell shock was just the lens of 1910s Europe. Isn't it possible that PTSD is simply the lens of 21st century Western medicine trying to categorize a universal, spiritual human pain?
It is an essential humility science must maintain. The current neurobiological model is the most empirically validated framework we have, and it saves lives. But it is the map, not the territory. The human experience of surviving horror will always be wider than the diagnostic criteria.
Which brings us to the final concept, and perhaps the most vital takeaway. It challenges the Western goal of merely returning a patient to their baseline, post-traumatic growth.
A profound paradigm shift. It doesn't romanticize trauma or suggest it was a blessing in disguise. The pain is undeniable. But the theory posits that the agonizing cognitive restructuring required to survive rebuilding a shattered worldview can lead individuals to levels of functioning that far exceed their pre-trauma baseline.
I picture it like a house burning down. You don't just sweep up the ashes and build the exact same house. In the process of rebuilding, because you know fires exist, you dig the foundation deeper. You build with fire-resistant stone. The new structure is born of tragedy, but inherently stronger.
We see this frequently in survivors of natural disasters, severe illnesses, or profound grief. They report a newly profound appreciation for the fragility of life. They discover an internal reservoir of strength they never knew they possessed. Interpersonal relationships become richer and more empathetic.
It's the mechanism of meaning-making. You don't choose the trauma, but you retain the ultimate agency in choosing the meaning you extract from surviving it.
Recognizing this capacity stands as empirical proof that the human mind possesses an extraordinary innate capacity for radical, transformative evolution in the face of despair.
And that synthesizes our journey today. from Shakespearean characters and WWI trenches to the hyperactive amygdala and the promise of exposure therapy.
The science proves unequivocally that trauma is not a character flaw. It's a profound biological injury to the survival system. And the brain's neuroplasticity means it can be healed.
Whether you're prepping for a meeting, supporting a friend, or just trying to understand human nature, I hope this deep dive brought some clarity. But before we go, I know you had a final thought regarding the epigenetics we discussed earlier.
Yes, this leaves a lingering question to ponder. If the horrific traumatic scars of Holocaust survivors can be chemically imprinted onto the genes of their children, making the next generation more hypervigilant, is it not equally biologically plausible that the intense, deliberate work of healing does the exact same thing? Is it possible that our hard-won resilience, our therapy, and our post-traumatic growth are also being genetically encoded to make the next generation inherently stronger?
Wow, that shifts the entire paradigm. The exhausting work of rewiring the brain isn't just an act of self-preservation, it's an act of generational protection. You're healing the people who come after you.
The ultimate biological legacy.
Early on, society wanted trauma to be as simple as a broken bone, a clean X-ray. The reality is infinitely more complex. The X-ray couldn't capture the invisible scars on the amygdala or the epigenetic tags on our DNA. But the evolution of this science shows us we are finally learning how to read the shadows, and we are learning how to set the bone so the healing can begin. Thanks for taking the deep dive with us.